Hey, how you doing? This is Mu'taz Abu speaking, and I would like to start this course, Poetry 1, with this first week slide. And this slide, we're gonna start with what is meant by poetry. What do you know about poetry? What is the definition of poetry, and how you can approach it? Well, poetry actually doesn't have that real clear definition, but poetry is perceived as fictional. It's fiction at the end of the story. It's not true. It's not real. It is actually made out of the imagination of the poet. That's why it uses a specialized language. So you can't use a normal language. You have to use a very specific language. And the specific language is used to reveal some points and ideas and hidden meaning. Um, in many cases, it lacks a pragmatic function, right? So we need to know that we do actually have these most important things. We do have the language, pragmatic functions, and in order to achieve ambiguity. All right. So poetry is fictional, all right? Why? Because it uses a very specific language, and the poet himself intends to lack pragmatic function, and it's also ambiguous. Why? Because um, he has to hide information. Why? Because to protect himself. But if someone who is very familiar with the language of poetry, he will definitely understand what the poet is all about. So if we move to the other part, here we do have the onwards, the outward of indications, how the poetry indeed started to move out and changes until we have it for this modern life. And the first thing you need to know that the individual text lines in poetry do not fill the entire width of the page. So it does not fit the A4 page. It is in a small column. It is in a part of a page. Once you see the shape of the poem, you will definitely understand that this is a poem. It's not a piece of reading. It's not a piece of writing. It's not newspaper, but it is a poem. So the shape of the poetry, right, gives you an indication that you are reading a poem. So the first thing is you have to pay attention for the shape, and in order to understand that this is an indication for a poem, right? For example, if you have an A4, okay, you can't just fill the whole page. You just need to take some small lines over here, and from the first shape, you will definitely understand that you are dealing with a poem, not a piece of writing. All right. The other thing is that poetry is often associated not only with language, but a dense of such specialized language. So we do have a lot of language, a lot of very specific language that is only used in poetry. You can't find it in a story, you can't find it in a novel, and you can't either find it in drama. So the language or the words are only used for poems, for poetry. You can't use it in any other place. What else? The poetry is considered to use or loves using a lot of structural phonological, morphological, and syntactic overstructuring. So when you're talking about structure, they complicate it. They make it more complex. They make it more difficult for the reader to understand. You find a lot of syntactic and semantic and morphological ambiguity in order to hide meaning as much as they can, right? So you have to pay attention for the sound patterns because they have meaning, and the style and the meter, metrical devices, and the style even plays a role. A stanza can be used for imaginary, and the type of the text itself can actually have a real good meaning. So the language and the shape plays a very good role in the so poetry also known with this subjectivity. It's all about the personal experience of a it's all about the personal experience of the poet. So the poet himself indeed is a person who talks about his own experience. It's subjective. It has to do with emotions and feelings, right? Uh, it is very important that he is talking about his own ideas and thoughts and real. Well, you need to talk. We need to focus here that this is true. It's subjective. It is about personal experience, but at the same time, it does not apply for all kinds of poems, right? Because we do have very different kinds of poems. Some of them are didactic, educational. It is for learning things. Some of them are philosophical, right? It has to do with the philosophy, like a metaphysical period. It talks about the philosophy of life, how people can understand and approach each other. And it's didactic, teaches you how to write, how to learn more vocabulary, and to learn a very specific language. This is all about how you can actually learn more from literature. It's didactic, it's education, right? So the last thing is that you guys need to know is it's for communication, and the situation in poetry is very similar to one in the prose, but that poetry does not include dialogue. That's the inner, let's say that there is no dialogue inside the poetry, but rather you can have a monologue. Monologue, it's about a person who talks to himself, right? A person who talks to himself, right? So you guys definitely understand what is meant by this, and you need to look at this um, chart, look at this table. The author of the poem is outside of the whole message, right? So this is the message. The bigger square is the message. The author and the actual reader is outside the poem and the message, right? The speaker here is a person that is made by the author to represent his own ideas. And it's all about the character himself who speaks and the character who listens. So we have only one person. That's why we call it a monologue. Monologue, that's someone who talks to himself. So he speaks and he listens at the same time. So sometimes there is an addressee, someone you're talking to, but sometimes it doesn't. Why? Because the guy talks to himself, but um, in a hidden way, he's talking to someone else. He wants to reveal his own message to someone else, but he can't say it directly because he's gonna have a lot of problem for his own life. So he wanna protect his life, and he says that he speaks to himself all the time. So now again, we have the poem. The poem is all about the speaker and the addressee. Both of them are optional, but the character here talks to himself using the message. So the man speaks with a message. The message goes back to himself. The addressee here is only optional. Sometimes he talks to the addressee in indirect way, in order to avoid having problem for the corrector. All right. So poetic text now, let's summarize what we have already discussed. And let's say that we have some notable exceptions, right? We do have some uh, exceptions here and there, but it follows a kind of a we do have a relative brevity, which means that is short. It's not that much long. It is very few. It is abbreviated in a form or in order to reveal the message in a very short form of language. So the most compressed form of literature is poetry. Keep that in mind. The most compressed form of language is poetry. So we do have dense of expressions. Dense here means a lot of, a lot, a lot of. A lot of means here that you guys, it's abundant. It's very full of expressions. And this is very important. Why? Because again, he wants to hide his meaning and not to be understood by anyone. So the public that cannot understand what's going on inside the text or the poem until they actually understand poetry in details. And this takes really long time to understand what is meant by poetry. And it's all about subjectivity, right? It's subjective, it's personal experience, which is very different from other texts, right? Probably if you're talking about a newspaper, you're talking about a book, or you're talking about any kind of literature, sometimes it doesn't talk about a person's personal experience, but poetry is meant to be for personal experience. It has some kind of musical or song-like quality. So we do have a kind of poetry like lyric, which is indeed designed for making a music. So whatever you listen to a music, then in that case, you are listening to a kind of poetry. But this kind of poem is designed to be having more musical stuff, more musical sounds and patterns, sound patterns that help you actually have a kind of music that goes along with music. And again, it's structurally and phonologically over-structured. So it has very complicated structure, which is very different from the norm. Why? Again, because it must hide a meaning from the public. Only elevated and clever people, and those who have very long experience in poetry, can understand exactly what is meant by this hidden meaning. Again, it's syntactically and morphologically overstructured. The syntax, the structure of sentences, and the morphology, the structure of words, is also complicated, more difficult, hard to understand. Why? Because the meaning has to be hidden from the public. And of course, all of these things will definitely lead somebody to be deviate, to go astray, to be very far from the everyday language. Because if he uses the everyday language, then it's going to be understood by the public, and the poet or the speaker will definitely have a problem in his life. Atheistic or efficiently, which means that they draw attention to themselves. Since they are talking about their own personal experience, then they're talking about themselves. And this is an art, right? An art for, because he's going to show himself how much he is clever in the language and form, and how he is great at culture, that he takes more references, more other experiences and wisdom from other cultures and bring it into his own writing of poetry to show how much he is clever, right? So if someone talks about the ancient battles that happened in the ancient times, then the guy wants to say that he has a great knowledge of history, and that history is depicted in his poem, which means that he understood exactly and completely everything that is discussed and mentioned in poetry or in other previous culture. So it's a kind of show off of his own knowledge. All right, let's go very fast now for the types of poetry, right? We do have lyric poetry, we do have narrative poetry, and then we do have descriptive and didactic poetry, all right? So this one has to do with songs, and we're gonna know what are the differences between them, but in a very general way. And then we have narrative poetry, which talks about detailed actions and events happened in the past, and descriptive, which describes and teach people how to do and how to deal with poetry, right? For example, here, a lyric poetry, we do have four types. One is called lyric and elegy, ode, and sonnet. Ode and sonnet. So we do have lyric, elegy, ode, and sonnet. Lyric, it is actually short. So it's not that long. It has to be short. That's why it's used for songs. It's not narrative. That's why it's short. It does not narrate events. And actually, the speaker presents a state of mind and or an emotional state, whether he is in love, whether he is angry, whether he's in grief and sad because he lost someone, or whether he loves his country, whether he wants to go to war and sacrifice for his family. All of these things are considered to be a state of mind. That's why we use lyric. And you can listen to the music and songs that we have today. It is actually all made by lyrics. So lyrics are considered to be used for songs and music. The second part is elegy. Elegy is formal one. Lament, which means when you actually are very sad for the death of someone and you need to give something in his memory, for his memory, you want to immortalize his name, which is called in Arabic الرثاء. أغنية والرثاء. All right. And for examples, Tennyson's in the Memoriam, and he was talking about his death of his son, and the guy wrote this kind of piece of writing and this poem in order to immortalize the death of his son, right? And he succeeded by writing a kind of elegy, right? And then we have ode. Ode is a long lyric poem. So ode is a lyric poem, but the difference is that it is long. So when it's short, it's lyric, but it's very long, then it is ode. But it's not a narrative, but it is a serious subject written in elevated style. So the difference, if I ask you a question, for example, what is the difference between lyric and ode? Ode, has a serious subject. It is written in an elevated style. It's a very formal one, right? It's more formal than lyric. It's more serious than lyric, and it is longer than lyric. All right. And then we have the sonnet. Sonnet is a love poem, you see? So sonnet talks mainly about love, and it talks about the love's suffering, how much he suffered, and sacrifice for his own love, and how much he was hoping to get his own love, but it didn't work the way he liked. And it came from Italy. So in the origin, the source, it started in Italy and become popular in England, right? Sometimes it's also used for religious experience, as happened in John Donne and John Milton, and sometimes it talks about the reflection of an art. Like, for example, if you have a very beautiful painting and then you want to talk about it, then you start writing a sonnet and how much the greatness of making or drawing that kind of drawing or paint. And sometimes it also talks about war experience. Sonnet, I think it's also emotional. It talks about emotions. You see here, it's love, it's religious, it's war, it's reflection, and but it can't be sung. It can't be a song, right? So that is the difference between sonnet and lyric. A sonnet cannot be a song. The second part today is narrative poetry. Narrative poetry, which means a narration to narrate events that is actually going on. And this is actually a verbal representation. It's a verbal representation, which means this is a verbal representation in verse. It talks about events. That's why it's called narrative, because you narrate events. It talks about characters, because the characters are the ones who are actually making the events, through a plot, a plan, a very well prepared plan. And of course, we do have a narrator here, a person, the speaker, who actually narrates all kinds of the events that are happening for the characters. And it could be a love story, it could be a father or a son, it could be a deed of a hero or heroine, a king, a prince, a princess, a queen, whatever. All of these actually are narrated and represented by a narrative poetry. Why? Because it just needs to narrate the events that happened in the past, and they just want to make it be written in the books. All right. Then narrative poetry, we do have three kinds, 1 and 2 and 3. The epics, the mock epic, and the ballad. The epic, one of the features, it's very large. It's a large scale. It talks in terms of length and topic. So the length, which is very long. The topic, it's a very broad topic. You need to talk about it. It might be talking about how the nation was actually it talks about a nation, for example, and might be talking about history, nation's affairs, and then of course it's also written in elevated style, but you have to know very sure, and this is one of the most important features of epics, is that it's supernatural beings, like Superman, Batman. Nowadays they want to enter a king with the supernatural powers, probably one of the angels that interfered, that supernatural, then the power of nature that interfered inside this epic and make it very something that is very extraordinary, that cannot be done by human beings. All right. And later on, we do have epic. All right, epic here talks about make use of epic conventions, and again, as any other kinds of kind of narrative poetry, it is written in elevated style. But the only difference, it's a great importance. It talks about important matter, but in a very different way now, which is here. That is the most important thing. Is that insignificant occurrences, and this is very important. So you guys have very insignificant, unimportant things to happen, and you make it of a great importance. For example, the rape of the lock. The rape of the lock. It's all about a story of a young beauty whose suitor secretly cuts off a lock of her hair. So there's a small tie in her hair that was actually cut off by a person. But the cutting off here is signified to be for something more important, greater in significance, and make it through a very trivial and silly story. So the guy uses a very silly story in order to hide the meaning behind it, you know, to indicate a very important significance. That's why we call it mock epic. So it's an epic. The meaning is epic, but the style and the form and the story is mock, is something mockery, something to make laugh on. That is why it is insignificant occurrences. And the last one is ballad. The ballad, it's pretty much the same as epic, but the difference is that, the ballad, maybe the repetition here, but the ballad is a very long, a very long, yeah, the ballad is something that is very long, and it talks more about song. It's a very long song, and it is used for the purpose of showing the fact or long song. So it's a song, but it's more uh, a longer song. Right. We do have the last one here. It's descriptive and didactic poetry. Let's listen. All of these previous mentioned things are considered to be lengthy and has detailed descriptions. That's why we call descriptive poetry, right? Ballad, epic, mock epic, all of these things are very long in terms of length, are very long poetry forms, and the C's are in direct speech. That's why we call it dramatic poetry. It has to do with the drama and events. It does not state directly what the speaker is trying to say. You have to go into the events and live inside these events in order to understand what's going on inside the poetry, in order to understand the meaning behind all this kind of poem. But you have to understand that the purpose of poem is didactic, is educational. It is used to teach something. So at the end of the story, at the end of the whole poem, you have to come up with something that you learn, a learning objective. The learning objective of such a poem can be done through a form of very specific instruction. So there are a lot of instructions inside this poem, and in order, you need to understand every single event inside the poem in order to understand what is meant by this poem, what is the meaning behind this poem. For example, you can learn how to catch a fish, as in James Thomson, The Season, or how to write a good poetry, right? This is didactic, this is educational, this is for learning, as in Alexander Pope's essay on criticism. So the guy teaches you very well how to write a good poetry through using the criticism. That's why it's instructive. It has so many instructions. In order to learn how to write a good poetry, then you have to follow a lot of instructions, a lot of steps in order to understand what is meant by poetry. Or to give you a wisdom, a moral, a lesson to learn in your life, what is meant by treason, friendship, uh, being a hero, saving the world, having a very supernatural world, or probably going to be theoretical, something that you learn from history, or at least you can have it something practical that talks about real life, like what is in the Shakespeare's poetry, for example. Shakespeare's poem, he was also talking about the practical wisdom that can be used over time. Even you can use these wisdom points that Shakespeare made in our current life, our present life, right? Why has it become uh, didactic? Because Horace asked the people that poetry should have two main concepts: the prosody, and the delective. It has to be learning, it has to be educational, it has to have educational objectives. At the same time, it has to be pleasurable, it has to be entertaining for the reader. So when you read any form of literature or poetry, in particular, you will actually feel the pleasure. At the same time, you're going to learn a lot of ideas. All right. So it is prosody and declare. Prosody and declare again. So we do have here didactic poem. It is meant for teaching something. You have to come up with something to learn. It could be catching a fish and writing good poetry. And this is an example in the James Thompson's season. He teaches you how to catch a fish through a poem, and to write good poetry in Alexander Pope's essay on a criticism. It could be also theoretical, moral, theoretical, practical knowledge. Okay, moral talks about wisdom, theoretical also about wisdom and some general ideas and thoughts and beliefs and ideologies, and practical knowledge which you can use in your life, like here catching a fish, for example. Okay, how to manage a war, how to be very inspirational and be active in your life. The one who asked for this is called Horace. Horace says one thing, which is poetry should combine, it has to have prosody and delective. So it has to be learning, it has to be pleasurable. And this was on the 20th century, but he was reluctant to say that, but at the end of the story, he used it as teaching tool. Remember that in English speaking countries in general, they don't have like a Holy Quran that is full of knowledge and language, but they do have literature, and literature is the only way they can actually develop and improve their own language and vocabulary and knowledge. So make sure you guys understand exactly what is meant by poetry and literature in general. Right. I think we came to the end of this presentation, and I hope you guys understand what is meant by such thing, by such a presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I think next time, inshallah, we will continue. If you have any questions, please prepare them for the Zoom meeting in order to discuss and explain more about the points you didn't understand. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.